This video is on assessing and managing your mental health and overall happiness. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about what you can expect if you were to go to more traditional route of getting a mental health care provider, seeing a therapist, etc. That'll be very brief because I want to then switch gears into giving you some useful models or frameworks or even protocols you can use on a kind of a personal level. If you say, I don't need to go through that whole process, but I just want to get some things to assess my own sort of baseline and manage my own mental health, I want to give you most of the video will be dedicated to that. So let's get into it, but I want to give a disclaimer before we start this video because given this subject matter, I think it's worth doing. I am not a licensed mental health care provider. I'm not a social worker, psychotherapist, psychologist, psychiatrist, etc. So that's my disclaimer. And the second is that if you are watching this video because you think, I may have a pretty severe case or I have suicidal thoughts or I really feel like I'm presenting with a more technical disorder like obsessive compulsive disorder or severe anxiety or something, go ahead and look into getting a mental health care provider, whether it be with a community health center, your physician, therapist, those are all resources you can contact, and that's going to take you a long way, as opposed to just kind of going at it yourself. So there's a disclaimer, but now we can get into the subject matter. So let's talk about first how this works in the more traditional clinical settings if you were to seek treatment and how they help you to understand and assess your own mental health. So typically, as part of the intake, you'll get a series of tests. The first are physical tests, as well as maybe even lab tests, because it turns out there are hormonal imbalances in the body, especially things like your thyroid or your hormones, that can drive things that feel like mental health disorders. So that's kind of the starting place. Even a sleep study could be, because if you're not sleeping well, you're probably going to feel a lot of the same symptoms as depression. They then often take you through an extensive mental history, and this can actually be kind of an interesting thing that you can do on your own, is do some digging into your parents' history, your aunts and uncles, and then maybe even your grandparents. And a lot of times you can find things that you may be at risk for. A very close friend of mine recently, he's doing a research study that involved mental health, and he had some conversation with his family, and it really shed light on some risk factors that he may have because he had several family members commit suicide, and that had to do with schizophrenia and things like that. So this piece is kind of tracing out your lineage to better understand that kind of genetically where you come from and some of the factors that you may be at risk for in terms of your mental health and physical health, but in this case we'll talk about mental. Then oftentimes a provider will take you through a personal history, which goes through kind of your life story, and a lot of times you may find that there have been some traumatic experiences that now may be presenting themselves with certain aversions or unhelpful behaviors or even mental patterns and stories. And then finally, you have mental and cognitive tests, right? So these are things they'll put you through that are around behaviors, your emotional states, your tendencies, your patterns, as well as maybe even some cognitive kind of performance tests around like memory and how well you process information, because all of those things affect, of course, or assess your mental functioning. So you'll get all of those, and then typically, I can't speak for all therapists, all backgrounds, all whatever, but a lot of this will then be tied to something called the DSM, which is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, I think, or mental health or something like that. But it's basically like a textbook or guidebook or reference book of all of these different mental disorders, it's kind of the gold standard, so to speak, in terms of the clinical side of psychology for how we understand and treat things, right? In the same way that if you go to the doctor and you show up with all these symptoms and they test you and they say, oh, you have strep throat, you need this medication, right? Obviously, it's not quite that clean cut in the realm of mental health, but generally it's saying, based on your questions in the DSM-5, that's the most updated version, we see you're presenting with A, B, and C, and the treatment for that is this type of therapy and maybe this medication or whatever. So that's the idea, right? Again, it's not that simple, but they try to get some diagnoses in there and treat them according to that manual. And I will actually link down below to some resources you can do for the types of assessments they give. Now, usually level 1 is kind of just generic in the sense that it's not totally targeted. It's just trying to figure out what you might be presenting with, what issues you might have. Then level 2 gets a little more specific, maybe drilling into, is it an anxiety thing? Is it a depression thing? Is it obsessive compulsive, behavioral addiction, whatever. And then they also have some assessments for severity. So I'll include those down below, like I said, and you can also start with those and just maybe answer a few of the questions yourself just to, again, knowing that if you think you may need, you're in a pretty bad place, better to seek a provider and have them administer that so that you make sure you do it correctly and you're getting a true assessment of your baseline mental health. But if you're sort of just curious, maybe again, those are some inventories or assessments that you can take to start to say, well, maybe I have a little bit of a challenge with this or with the other thing, etc. So right there, that's just a snapshot of how to, in a kind of a clinical setting, how to understand and assess your own mental health. They're going to take you through physical testing, your mental health history of your relatives and family, your own personal history and story, and then mental and cognitive tests. And there are some assessments like I gave down there that are straight from the DSM, the American Psychological Association. Now, let's turn our attention towards, if you're watching this video and saying, oh, yeah, Jackson, I don't think I need all that. I would rather just get some own tools for myself. Let's shift to that now, because part of my mission with my happiness research and teaching is also to empower people with the skills to better manage their own psychology. Because I think in a lot of cases, you don't necessarily need a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a therapist or anything like that if you have some actual tools and principles and protocols that you can use to be your own psychologist. And so that's what we can think about here. So again, how do we assess and understand our own mental health? Well, I'd say there's kind of three big ways to do it. So first, you have what I would just call an intuitive way, which is kind of like a gut reaction, right? We kind of know generally if we're not in the good place or if we're doing pretty well, or maybe we're kind of somewhere in the middle. And I think that that is a worthwhile measure, is to be able to kind of intuitively say, how am I doing lately? And that may be day to day. Am I feeling good? Am I in a good mood? Or am I feeling kind of blue a lot of the time? And it may be more kind of life as a whole. Yeah, from a 1 to 10, my life is really good or not so good or somewhere in the middle. Okay, so you have intuitive. The second is, I think, underutilized, and it can be a very powerful exercise. This is something I do every 6 months. It's a 360. And now this is very common in professional coaching or leadership development for like executives and business leaders. It's where you actually get the input of other people on how you show up. And you may be hesitant at first, be like, well, how would someone else know how I'm doing mentally? Well, a lot of times you're giving away more than you may think. So this protocol can be a little bit challenging. You want to have people you can trust, and you want to make sure you maybe frame it to them in a way that doesn't make them feel uncomfortable, because you may be asking them to be like, hey, how do you think I'm doing? But a simple way to do this is to just have a conversation with maybe 3 to 5 people that you spend the most time with and that you feel like can give you an honest assessment. So personally, I do this every 6 months. I call it a happiness audit. But I basically ask the 5 people I spend the most time with, hey, just snap judgment, be totally honest, don't overthink it. How happy am I from a 1 to 10? Right, and then I take the average and I try to make sure I'm staying in a good place. And like I said, this is not a very scientific approach, okay? So don't get me wrong. But the idea here is it just gives you a baseline. Am I doing a little better than I thought, a little worse than I thought? And it can just be helpful to see other people's opinions. And like I said, though, you also want to tell the person, look, it's not going to hurt my feelings. Be honest, that sort of thing. And so you can try to apply that in your own state. Again, maybe it's more of an in-depth conversation with someone you trust. And you say, hey, does it feel, how am I showing up lately? Does it feel like I'm in a good place, or do you see anything that I might be struggling with? And maybe they'll say, hey, you're overall, I think, in a pretty good mood, but I know that sometimes you feel like you get really nervous talking to people. And so maybe you say, oh, okay, I see there's some area there around like social anxiety that maybe I can improve in. Or maybe they say, you've been always super positive, but the last month it seems like something's off and you've been really down. And so again, it's not a scientifically valid measure, but it's just giving you some baselines to assess where you're at, if something's really off, if things are going well. And you can do this over time. Maybe you do it now, and then in 3 months you check back in again, and your friends say, oh yeah, I think it's working. So that's the idea here, right? This is, again, a pretty broad category, but the 360 is where you're kind of getting the perspectives of other people involved so that you can get a more nuanced baseline assessment of your kind of mental health and happiness level. Now, the third bucket I think will be the most useful to you, and that is, again, it's somewhat intuitive, but it would be a self-report. So self-report in the scientific literature refers to really any measure that is self-reported. So like I just referenced some of those tools from the DSM that are assessments, a lot of those are self-reports because they're going to ask you, hey, in the last couple of weeks, how have you felt? Or how often have you had trouble falling asleep? Or, from 1 through 5, how would you rate your emotional health? Whatever. All of those things are self-reports. And you can kind of do these on your own. You can search for some, but I'm going to give you a few that you may consider, again, to get that kind of assessment of your mental health. So the first category, I would say, broadly speaking, is you want to think about you can be happy in your life, and you can also be happy with your life. Now, at first, that sounds a little weird maybe, but it turns out these are two slightly different things. The first is really the experience of day-to-day mood and happiness and emotional state. And the other is more of the stepping back, looking at your life as a whole. Okay, it turns out these are fairly distinct. This comes from the work of a very famous psychologist named Daniel Kahneman. And, think about like this, you may be like, my life overall is good. I'm really successful. I've got a great family. Things are going really well. But the last couple of weeks I've, had trouble sleeping, and I have this big project that's giving me a lot of anxiety. So it's like in my life, maybe has been a little lower, but I'm still very satisfied with my life as a whole. Now, conversely, you may be having, I don't know, you're partying and having a lot of fun, and you're feeling really good, and you have great relationships, but maybe when you step back to your life as a whole, you're not really sure about the direction you want or something like that. So again, in the day-to-day, you're pretty happy, but life as a whole is a little lower. So I like to give you those two things just to break things down a little bit, because the components, shall we say, of the in my life versus the with my life are actually fairly distinct. So there's different things that can improve each of those areas. So I'm going to give you a visual to help you digest this. Now, when you think about the experienced happiness day-to-day in my life, I think there's really three main components there. So you have positive or negative affect. So that is like your mood. So there can be many different varieties of this, but generally, am I experiencing more positive emotional states? Things like confidence and joy and peacefulness and excitement and enthusiasm. And do I have relatively low negative affect, right? So these other negative emotions, things, like anxiety or fear or sadness. You also have engagement or kind of interest. So this is, I would say, engaging in activities or behaviors that bring you a sense of, they could be fun, or just they keep you interested and kind of immersed and in the zone, right? That sense of, maybe you're a creative writer and you sit down and write for 2 or 3 hours. You maybe wouldn't call that like joyful, but you maybe wouldn't call it bad. It's kind of just like you were in the zone, right? You were focused. So that's another component of experienced happiness. And then you have connection, right? So sense of relatedness and relationship with other people. Spending time with people you enjoy being around is a source of happiness in itself. So you have that under the experienced, and under the more reflective, happy with my life, there are a few things you can look at. Meaning. So, right, do I just have a sense of purpose and meaning, a sense of significance? Do I have a sense of achievement, right? That can be related to confidence, or what's called self-efficacy, that you feel like you have the ability to set meaningful goals and accomplish them. You have a sense of optimism, right? So that's kind of like hopefulness about the future. And then you also have connection over here, because I think that another piece of life satisfaction is having quality relationships. So the reason I give you this first model, bringing it back to me, is because if you were to go back and take a screenshot of that, this can be a little diagnostic tool that you use to start to assess in a little more depth your own mental health and well-being, because you can look at this and say, how happy am I in my day-to-day experience of life? Okay, and you can do maybe a rating of 1 to 5 there. And then you can zoom in a level and say, well, am I spending a lot of time in positive emotional states or more negative states? Am I doing things that I find interesting and engaging and get me into a state of absorption? And how am I doing in terms of social connection? Same thing. You say, well, 1 to 10, stepping back, thinking about my life as a whole now, how am I from a 1 to 5? And then zoom in and think, well, do I do things? Do I feel like I have a sense of meaning? Do I feel like I am achieving meaningful things? Am I feel optimistic or hopeful about the future? And once again, how am I doing in terms of my social connection and relationships? And again, you can even score those from 1 to 5. And then you get into a place where all you have to do then is look and say, well, what are the ones that I'm not doing very well on? And what can I do to do those? That's really the protocol, right? Is you take this model and you do what I call check and adjust. So you say, okay, I'll walk through a hypothetical one. Maybe I say, I feel like overall I'm very satisfied with my life as a whole. Things are going in the right direction. My work is very meaningful. I've been, accomplishing goals. I'm very disciplined. I'm optimistic about the future, and I think relationships are in a good place. But lately I think I've been a little bit low and a little bit anxious in terms of my mood. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in there, and I look at positive versus negative affect. I can look at engagement and fun, and I can look at connection. And maybe I say, well, I've been spending a lot of time with my friends, so that's good. But, under some of my hobbies that are less work-related, I haven't been spending as much time just reading or doing things that I just kind of find intrinsically fun and engaging. So maybe say, okay, I'm going to spend a little bit more time reading and a little bit more time just with the days off to, do my hobbies and whatnot. And then under positive and negative, maybe I say, yeah, I'm usually in a pretty good mood, but like I said, I've been a little bit stressed and anxious lately. So I'm going to write down what are 2 or 3 things that I can do to help shift into a calmer state. Well, I could start trying meditation, and then maybe once a week I do a guided yoga class or get a massage, whatever. Okay, so what we're doing there, right, in this idea of assessing, understanding, and managing your mental health, in this case, this kind of walking through this toolkit helped me to understand where I'm at baseline, target a few areas of improvement, and now I can leave, so to speak, saying, okay, I know that my kind of weakness right now is that I'm taking on too much stress, and I have a couple of protocols in place to help that. I'm going to spend a little bit more time reading and doing fun hobbies. I'm going to take a little bit of off time, or a little bit of extra off time each week, I should say, to engage in those things. And I'm going to do some practices like guided meditations and yoga to help me calm down and lower my anxiety levels, right? That's the idea here, is giving you some very useful models so that you can run with these and kind of assess your own baseline. So I do want to share one other important caveat to all this, and that is understanding that there's something very powerful called expectation effects. So expectation effects come from the literature, and you can look at these and they're pretty freaking interesting. So one study, they had people basically drink a kind of smoothie, and one group was told it was a healthy smoothie that was really good for you and had like 200 calories. Another group, it was the same smoothie. Now, the other group was told it was a milkshake that had 500 calories and was like indulgent in junk food. Well, it turned out that people in the healthy group, their actual physiological body and their digestive system responded differently compared to those in the second group. The second group reported higher levels of satiation, which means they were more full, and the corresponding changes in a hormone called ghrelin, which regulates appetite, suggested that they actually felt more full and their body thought they consumed more calories than they did. Whereas the other group was less full and they, had lower or different levels of ghrelin. So the reason that study is so interesting is because it speaks to how your expectations can actually change you at a biological level of how you respond to things. Now, there's also really wonderful work by Dr. Aaliyah Crum in her lab that looks at this in the more mental domain, how people's stress mindset has similar effects. So if you take two groups of people, right, group A and group B, in group A you tell them, hey, stress is enhancing. It turns out that while, huge doses of stress and trauma are not very good for you, acute stress, so some anxiety or some nervousness about a project or some added pressure, actually helps sharpen your cognitive performance and make you more effective, which is true. There's another group that gets a stress is debilitating mindset. So they say, hey, stress can lead to physical performance issues, mental health issues. It can lead to all these things that make you kind of perform at a suboptimal level. Now, here is the interesting thing. Both of those stories are true. There are aspects of stress that are enhancing, and there are aspects of stress that are debilitating. But what happens is, based on what you focus on, Group A performs much better in stressful situations, and Group B tends to perform worse because of the expectation effect. So the reason I say that here is because your expectations may be a very critical factor in influencing how you assess yourself, and conversely, your assessment can later shift how you feel. If you do one of these assessments, let's say, and you think, whether you look at the DSM one or maybe you even do your own, and you say, I'm doing pretty bad right now in anxiety, maybe I have anxiety disorder. You may be setting yourself up with an expectation effect that over the next few weeks, you're kind of going to be biased towards feeling more anxiety. So the reason I say this is just a caution in that the expectations you have around this as you try to assess and understand your mental health can later influence how you actually present and how you experience your own mental health. So be very cautious, and I would say give yourself the benefit of the doubt. Give yourself a high expectation, right? If you have a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of stress, a lot of times that's just human. It doesn't mean you have a disorder. Okay, so that's an important caveat. And now what I'll leave you with is this, right? You have this kind of model, again, of in my life versus with my life, and you have a pretty simple protocol. You can look at each of those buckets and rate yourself from about a 1 to 5, and that should give you a pretty good assessment overall of your mental health. There's a couple other models you can look at that I probably won't get into because this video is already getting pretty long, but if you want to look into them, you look up Richie, Davidson, Plasticity of Wellbeing. He has a model of awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. You can also look up PERMA by Dr. Martin Seligman, which refers to positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and achievement. When you have all those things, you're going to flourish. Those are both very well-researched approaches. But thinking about my model, I'll put it up on the screen again. A simple way to do this is to do some self-reports, right? Give yourself a 1 through 5 in each of these buckets, sum up the total, and look at those areas where maybe you're like a 2 or a 3 or something, and then just write down a few ideas for how you can improve that, right? That's the beauty of this, is that, again, it's trying to empower you to understand and manage your own baseline with a certain rating, and then actually develop some protocols to improve it. And like I said, you can do a similar exercise with that 360-degree audit, where you maybe ask a few people, hey, how am I doing in terms of each of these categories or something like that. So bring it back. I hope that gives you a useful protocol to try to, again, understand and assess your own mental health, and then practically speaking, make some behavioral changes to improve it. But like I said, important disclaimer one more time that if you really feel like you're coming in low on any of these areas or things are getting problematic, to get help and talk to someone. So that's all for now. Here's a video that YouTube suggests you'll like. As always on this channel, you'll get practical tools from both the arts and the sciences to help you be happier in both work and in life. So thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.